G'day brothers and sisters, and welcome to Towards Maturity. I'm so excited to be going with you on this journey through the Gospel according to Luke. Before we begin studying any book of the Bible, it's always important to ask some foundational questions. Who wrote the book? When was it written? What is the genre? Now, the Gospel according to Luke falls into the classification of Greco-Roman bios, or biography. Historians in the ancient world would write biographies or histories about famous people, like the Roman emperors. And Luke sets about writing a biography about the life of Jesus. We also know that the Gospel of Luke is part of a two-volume history. Luke's Gospel is volume 1, and volume 2 is the book of Acts. So we know that when we read the Gospel of Luke, we are reading historical narrative. It is giving us information about the historical Jesus, and then in the book of Acts, the early church. So who was the author of these two volumes? Well, we know that Luke was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. If you read the book of Acts, it details information about the various missionary journeys that the apostle took. And Luke is mentioned. He refers to himself in this book as a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. So even though Luke was not a direct eyewitness to the life and the ministry of Jesus, we know that he was well placed to interview and to speak with the eyewitnesses and the first generation of Christians. And when you read Luke and you read Acts, we know that Luke, and you'll notice that Luke is a very careful historian. He gets his history right. He gets place names and people's names. He gets titles and job descriptions right. Luke is a very careful and thorough historian. So have full confidence, brothers and sisters, when you read his gospel, he is recording history and events that actually happened. The final question by way of background we want to explore is, when was Luke written? Most scholars tend to put Luke's gospel sometime after 70 AD, meaning it was written during the 70s, about 40 odd years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Now, even though the majority of scholars fall in that position, it can be argued, and I think it can be argued quite convincingly, that the Gospel of Luke was actually probably written in the 60s, so around 30 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. We can formulate this argument because if Luke and Acts are part of a two-volume set, in chapter 1 of the book of Acts, Luke will refer to his former book, i.e. the Gospel of Luke, which means that the book of Acts was written second. Now, in the book of Acts, Luke does not record the death of the Apostle Paul, meaning that Paul was most likely still alive when he completed the book of Acts. Now, although we don't know the precise details about when the Apostle Paul died, most people believe that he died sometime during the mid-60s, which means ipso facto, if Paul was still alive when the book of Acts was completed, then the Gospel of Luke must also have been written sometime prior to 70 AD, which is quite exciting when we think about this from a historical point of view. It's very rare that historians get history which is written so close to the actual events. When you compare the Gospels to any other work in the ancient world, they stand head and shoulders above the rest in terms of how close they are, their proximity to the actual events that they record. Luke, by profession, was a physician. Now, when we think about physicians, we shouldn't think about doctors and nurses like today, because ancient doctors and ancient physicians were quite different. Many of them were often slaves, though they were educated. And as we read through Luke's Gospel and also Acts, you can tell that Luke is very, very well educated. He's extremely well educated. In fact, the Greek grammar of Luke's Gospel and Acts is some of the most sophisticated Greek of the New Testament, rivaled probably only or exceeded only by the book of Hebrews. So we know Luke is very, very well educated, and he's an intelligent guy, and Colossians tells us that he's an ancient physician. But as we begin to read the Gospel of Luke, you'll notice he starts with these words. He says, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So notice he acknowledges that there are other biographies or there are other texts which are around documenting the life of Jesus. Most likely, Luke had access to the Gospel of Mark. Luke drew on the Gospel of Mark, which were the accounts. Mark was the scribe of the Apostle Peter. So Luke is able to draw on the existing traditions and the existing narratives they have from the eyewitnesses recording the details of Jesus' life. So that's incredible. Then he goes on to say in verse 3, "With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." Isn't this remarkable? Luke's central point is mentioned here in his prologue. It was very common when people were setting about to write an ancient historical work or a biography, they would write a prologue thanking the benefactor, the one who had paid for them to produce the work or the collection. And Luke mentions here who his benefactor is, Theophilus, and also what his central purpose is, that you, the reader, may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. So I want to encourage you, as you read through the Gospel of Luke, remember that Luke's purpose is that you may have full confidence that Jesus is who he said he was, and that he did indeed die for the sins of this world on the cross, and he did indeed come back from the dead, and the resurrection was seen by many reliable witnesses. And I want to draw your attention now for a moment to Luke's benefactor, Theophilus. He's a forgotten character sometimes in the New Testament. We tend to disregard his role, but it was extremely important. You see, to produce a volume or to produce a written text in the ancient world wasn't easy. Most people were illiterate and it was very, very expensive. So Theophilus puts his own money out there to sponsor Luke so that he can produce both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. And I think we owe Theophilus and Luke a great deal of thanks and gratitude, because if they didn't take the time to do this, you and I wouldn't have the breadth of information we have today, not only about the life of Jesus, but also about the first century early church. And imagine being in Luke's day. Most people were illiterate, they couldn't read and write, and it was expensive to produce this. So if you wanted to share the gospel message, the best way perhaps to do it is by speech, going around talking to people. The gospel was first passed on as an oral tradition. But Luke and Theophilus could see beyond. They recognized that God was going to do something incredible by codifying the gospel and by codifying the history of the early church in written text. You and I today and the church for centuries have gotten and received the blessing of their hard work. And in their day, they would never have seen that. They could never have imagined that God was going to use them in such a powerful way. But think about this. If it wasn't for Luke, if it wasn't for Theophilus, you and I would not know about the parable of the Good Samaritan or the parable of the prodigal son. We wouldn't know about the angelic visit to Mary. We wouldn't know about the shepherds who came at the birth of Jesus. So it's because of Luke and because of Theophilus that God has so richly blessed the church for centuries. And I want to encourage you with that message, brothers and sisters. Sometimes in life, we look to the here and now, but God will use us to achieve great things which ripple through the generations. You wouldn't have imagined that sitting down and writing a gospel in Luke's day would have been the most ideal way to share the gospel. But God, who sees into the future, who knows that when He uses us for something, there is a ripple throughout history and the body of Christ gets blessed for centuries and years to come. And I want to leave you with that thought, brothers and sisters. The work you do today to serve God will have a ripple effect in your family and amongst your community, so much so that because of your faithfulness today, others in the future will be blessed and others in the future will come to Christ because of your faithful service just like Theophilus and just like Luke were faithful to God in their day. So God bless you, brothers and sisters. I'm so excited to be going on this journey with you. So this is just an introductory video, and next time we will begin day 1. God bless you.